now being recorded.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. My name is John Pollack. I'm the User Support Specialist here at Quasi. Before we get started, I want to just remind everyone that we do have one more Cyberseminar this semester, a week from today at the same time, where Dr. Daniel Rothman of MIT will be presenting on branching of stream networks. But for now, I'd like to introduce Todd Rasmussen from the University of Georgia, who is also a board member of Quasi and who has been kind enough to host this fall series to introduce our speaker today. So please, Todd.
Thank you, John, and welcome, everyone. As John said, I'm Todd Rasmussen. I'll be hosting today's Quasi Cyber Seminar. And our guest today is Professor Mark Fonstad, who's an associate professor in the Department of Geography at the University of Oregon. And he'll be speaking on cellular modeling and monitoring of Riverscapes. Mark completed his BS at the University of Wisconsin, his MA at Ohio University, and his PhD at Arizona State University. And all of those degrees were in geography. And prior to coming to Oregon, Mark taught at Texas State and also worked at the Mountain Research Center at Montana State. Mark's research and teaching focuses on geomorphology, hydrology, and remote sensing, with a focus on the physical geography of rivers, as well as the fusion of physical geography with geographic information science. Currently, Mark is the co-director of the River Research Group at the University of Oregon and has co-authored 2 volumes, Complexity and Geomorphology, as well as the Remote Sensing of Rivers. Thank you, Mark, for speaking today, and I'll turn it over to you now.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank everyone for the invitation to speak today. It's wonderful to have such a broad audience and to be able to talk about some of the research that I've done and also some of the thoughts that I've had about the broader hydrologic community. And today's talk is a little unusual in the sense that instead of me having a specific research goal and we have normal research questions and results, there will be plenty of research in here. But I'd like to stand back for a moment and today and talk a little bit about the philosophical issues that go along with a methodological revolution, which is what is really happening right now in river science. But before I get going, I'd like to thank my collaborators in some of the work that you're going to see today, Patrice Carbonneau, who's at Durham University in England, James Dietrich, who's a PhD student of mine at here at the University of Oregon, as well as my colleague Andrew Marcus, Stephen Dugdale, who's in Quebec, and a number of former colleagues and students in Texas, Jay Parsons, Jennifer Jensen, and Brittany Corville, and another research colleague of mine, Carl Legleiter, at the University of Wyoming. And I'd like to start today by taking us to the not-so-distant past, the time when perhaps I was a student, somewhere between 15 and 20 years ago, and think a little bit about how we conceptualized rivers at that point. And when I say we, I mean most river scientists. And on the slide here, I'm showing networks. And the idea of networks, river networks, as lines connected by nodes is a very, very old idea. It's an idea that was first described in detail by Leonardo da Vinci in 1508. So, of course, like everything else, river science is started by Leonardo da Vinci. But this idea that rivers can be seen as one-dimensional or collections of one-dimensional geographical realms is both very old and still very common in river science. And you might think that, well, that's fine at network scales, but at smaller scales, at smaller areas, we look at things more carefully. We look at things in more detail. And you might think that way we can get away from a simple one-dimensional thoughts about rivers. And I started out this way, trying to understand rivers even as a student. And here's an example of measurement techniques that we had for rivers just 20 years ago, and still lots of people use today, which is you go out in the field, and you're at a river, and you have a ruler of some kind. And this ruler you can use to measure various properties of rivers. You can measure their width or depth. You can measure the slope of the river or the size of the materials it's moving around. The difficulty with using a ruler, whatever that is you are limited. As an individual, you are limited.
What are you doing?
Please go ahead and mute your lines. If you haven't already, you can do this by pressing *86 or have it mute on your phone.
Thanks. I am still hearing lots of people. I have the main problem with measuring rivers like this is that you are limited to how many that you can do. And as such, the history of measuring rivers is one where there are large spatial gaps. There are choices that we've had to make. We go and measure rivers in one place or another, and it's a problem of sampling. And here are some examples from mountain rivers. You might be interested in geomorphology, or in this case, the movement of woody debris through rivers. You might take those samples and build from them spatial pictures for how rivers change from one place to another. And these might show the differences of geologic time or ecological change, but they are at a particular scale because you've measured at a particular scale. The sampling involved limits you to that sort of scale. In some cases, we are able to augment our site measurements with more technical instruments. And this is a technical instrument from 10 or 15 years ago, a total station. And in this case, we could increase the precision of measurement as well as the rate of data collection. And we might do that because we think that the river has complexity in it. And that's that complexity that we think might be important. For example, it may be that at smaller areas, the complexity of particles in the river might be useful for spawning fish, for example, or for the habitats of macroinvertebrates. And in that case, we might want to measure at some higher resolution. The problem with doing this is that it tends to limit us in terms of the spatial extent that we can measure. And this is a real problem if we want to see the nature of the river as connected, and connections are all over in hydrology, not only in water flowing from one place to another, but fish can swim miles and miles, animals can move up and down, the distribution of seeds from one part of a forest to another move over very long distances, and so there is a price you pay for measuring at high spatial resolution in the field, such as in this example. And so people have tried various ways to fix that problem. They said, well, maybe we don't need quite so much precision. We can make classification maps, and it means we can move more quickly. We sacrifice a little bit of data quality, but we can move more quickly and do larger area analyses. And this is fine until you begin to realize that our classification systems sometimes limit us in terms of what explanation they can be used for. Also, in theory, our way of describing the river has changed. Here's a great example from many years ago, from the 1960s, the downstream and attestation hydraulic geometry of streams, which posits that there's a relationship between stream variables, such as drainage area and width, and that these are described by power functions. One of the difficulties with this theory, and it's a very commonly used theory, I use it probably weekly, is that there are, as you look at these graphs, you realize that these power laws, although they show general trends, have an awful lot of variability, and the variability is on the scale of an order of magnitude. Often we don't really realize that, and partly it's because the spatial variability is obscured by the fact that we're using logarithmic graphs. But it was nice to have some kind of laws, and so we didn't spend a lot of time to figure out why this spatial variability existed. It wasn't the center of attention. And this idea of large, broad theory has carried over into other fields. For example, into stream ecology, the river continuum concept, which is a major set of theories in river ecology, is derived partly from ideas of the hydraulic geometry. And so the result of that has been to a large degree, smoothly varying theories through the river space. Another set of concepts used, for example, in river restoration is that streams, the complexity of them can be broken up into classified regimes. And this is an idea that is very common. It's used in river restoration and in river monitoring. And this classification idea stems from the idea that we don't have data everywhere, and people need to be able to carve the complexity of rivers into a small group of sort of nicely behaving ideal forms. And that way it's easier for practitioners to decide what to do given a stream of a certain class. And one of the difficulties with an idea like this is it's difficult to test because rivers aren't exactly classified like this. And it's also difficult to use in areas of high complexity. And it's also not exactly clear what scale these classifications are supposed to be applied to. Even in our quantitative theories and models of rivers, the one-dimensional nature that was the focus 10 or 20 years ago, and is to some degree still today, is limited. For example, the step backwater modeling that's used for floodplain mapping is really based on the assumption of very strong downstream flows. We're not worried about secondary currents. And we kind of make the assumption that rivers have a very strong downstream autocorrelation, so we don't need to sample them too carefully or too much or too spatially rapidly. And we can use that in order to make maps, like the idea of putting cross-sections and assuming that there are constant variations between those cross-sections. Okay, I'm going to move ahead. Now, starting in the late 1990s, to some degree, and certainly rapidly advancing in the early 2000s, has been the idea that, spatial variability inherent in rivers is, in some case, should be the focus of study, and not just something added on after we make sample measurements. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about two areas that have been affected by that idea. One of them is in modeling, and I'm going to introduce the concept of cellular automata today. And the other is in remote sensing. And we'll also talk about the fusion between them later on. So let's begin with cellular automata modeling. First of all, when I say modeling, I'm going to be using modeling today to refer to simulation. And when I use the idea of simulation in terms of cellular automata, there are certain important reasons we do simulation. One of them is that we use simulation to predict how things are going to work, the system dynamics. But we can use it for other reasons as well. We don't have to be realists. We can use them to ask, what if something happens? What will follow that? We can use models to generate unexpected results. For example, emergent forms that we didn't put into the model. And we certainly can use simulations to simulate otherwise unobservable space-time scales, what's going to happen over 1,000 years, or what's going to happen even over 10 years. And most projects aren't 10 years long, so that's an important thing to be able to do. Cellular automata are a class of simulations that are dynamic. In other words, they allow measurement or analysis of change through time. They are generally seen as a lattice, like a piece of graph paper, that act as frames in a movie, so one graph paper after another. And this is very much like the mapping idea that we have in geography and in other geosciences, the idea that we can make maps of things, and the change from one map to another, the temporal change, in this case is something that we can use for prediction. In cellular automata, the change from one map to another is done by coupling the two maps with rules. And those rules can be of many kinds. They could be an algebra equation that connects the two maps. It could be a logical function. It could be some statistical relationship. It could be a lookup table. There are many ways that we could say how a map is going to change from one time to another. In Cellular Automata, we also have a restriction, which is that the change from one time to another is only the effects are only generated in a small area. In other words, a local neighborhood. I am standing in a cell, and to get to the next time step, the next map, I'm only going to be looking at my neighbor cells. And that sort of fits our understanding of how most processes work. Not all processes, but normally if I'm in the field and I look at water, the water is going to react to the slopes and processes right near it. It's not going to be reacting directly to something that's a mile away when we're talking about something that's going to happen a second from now. We can change the dimensionality of these maps, but normally in cellular automata modeling for geosciences, it's in 2 dimensions as a series of maps through time. Now, these maps can be carved up into a number of spaces. It could be a map made like a sheet of graph paper or a raster remote sensing image, but it can be other things. It can be an hexagonal array or a triangular array. It could be a voxel space, which is a set of 3-dimensional cubes. And we can use these different arrays for different purposes. For example, if we wanted water to have a set of volumes that had 3 very specific directions, we might want to use a voxel space. For the most part today, I'm going to be talking about 2-dimensional cellular automata, however. Okay, so one question when you make a model, and this is important for students learning their first model, is great, we can have maps and we can make predictions with them, but how do I make these rules? And this is one of the difficult things, because in the past, when we were limited by our spatial measurements, we had a lot fewer options for making rules for these kind of models. And for example, if we were going to use traditional physics, it was possible to discretize the physics and make them simpler so they could be solved in a 1-dimensional way relatively easily. Today, though, when we have 3-dimensional data and very complex spatial arrangements, it's sometimes difficult to use deductive analysis in that situation. So sometimes we use differential equations, and sometimes we use completely different approaches for rule development. We might use probabilities, for example. We might use expert rules from people who have been watching rivers for a long time. The advantage of cellular automata as a system of modeling is its flexibility. There's no reason why you can't use more than one of these ways of making rules altogether if you like. It makes it difficult to teach people which to use under which situation because you have so many options. Okay, here are some simple examples of cellular automata. Some of them related to hydrology and some of them not. Here's an early one on forest fires by Malmet and Turcotte. That forest fires can be simulated by cells that are either burning or not burning, and the cellular automata operates by looking and seeing both how burnable a cell is and by what the neighbor cells are doing the time before. And in that way, you can actually generate very complex dynamics for how forest fires spread and when they stop. Here's an example from landscape evolution. The generation of fractal river networks can be built through cellular automata. And this makes some sense, that the idea that rivers and their local geomorphology is directly connected to whatever's happening next to them. One of the more famous cellular automata models is that of braided rivers that Brad Murray and Chris Paola designed about a decade ago. That braided rivers are really only they're really only made by having a very small number of simple rules. The idea that water flows downhill, that there is a nonlinear relationship between the discharge and the amount of sediment that's transported, and that we can route sediment, we can either erode it or deposit it in proportion to the amount of sediment, and this will actually make braids in the rivers. And using braiding as an emergent form is one of the reasons why people use cellular automata. It's a model approach that lends itself well to emergent forms. Here's an example where that kind of approach has been modified and amended to add what if we grow plants on the cells as well as let the river deposit and erode sediment. And when you do that, it's possible to make single-channel rivers, which out of a braided river, and to study the interactions between the two. Something which was quite difficult to do before Cellular Automata as a modeling system. I'm going to skip a couple here. Cellular Automata are often criticized for their simplistic level of behavior, and it's absolutely true that most people use Cellular Automata for what I would call reduced complexity modeling, simple models that incorporate spatial complexity but are nevertheless have process simplicity. But it's not actually a requirement of the modeling system. Many kinds of models built in Cellular Automata can be incredibly physically precise, and a good example of that are Lattice gas Cellular Automata or Lattice Boltzmann Cellular Automata. And these are models that are built to try to reflect the Navier-Stokes equation for fluid flow, but they're built sort of from the ground up. They're built from simple interactions of cells, and their attempt is to conserve both mass and momentum, and doing so requires very large computers, but it also makes very realistic behavior. In this case, it's sediment transport past a wind fence. I'm going to skip a couple more. I would like to introduce just a simple field example of Cellular Automata, and it's going to be the simplest sediment transport model you've ever seen. That's the intention. It has to do with riverbank instability. We go out in the field and we want to map where rivers are more or less unstable. And sometimes we try to relate that to local variables like, oh, there's more vegetation here, or the sediment is smaller, whatever the local reason is. But it's difficult to get an idea for what's happening at the scale of the whole river. And that's something we would like to be able to test. Well, here's a simple model. If we imagine, it's kind of a game. We imagine students sitting in a lecture hall, and they each have their little tables, and we're going to start handing out homework to these students. And if we hand out the homework assignments at random, one at a time, they're okay with their homework until you get them up to maybe 4 pieces of homework. At that point, the students kind of go crazy, and they hand their homework to the nearby neighbor students. They can't handle that much homework. And if you are on the side of the classroom, you throw it out the window. And you might think, most of the time, when you watch this happen, most of the time nothing happens. But occasionally a student, by going crazy and handing their homework to their neighbors, will make their neighbors have too many pieces of homework, and you get kind of a chain reaction happen. And we might think of sediment in a river the same way. We might think that sediment piles moving around in rivers as blocks or just stacks of sediment. And if we get too much sediment, the water sort of piles up and it can push the sediment downstream, and it'll pass downstream. Or if it's at the edge, it might go out onto the floodplain somewhere. Most of the time, you add some sediment and nothing happens, but rarely that sediment might cause a chain reaction. And if you run a model like this through time, very interesting things happen. Most of the time, not much happens. Some of the time, a chain reaction will happen, and several bit blocks of sediment will move through the river. And then very rarely, nearly all the sediment is moved throughout the river. Now, here's the important point. In each of these cases, only a little bit of sediment was moved. And yet, what happened, the same amount was input, but totally different things happened as the output. This nonlinear nature of dynamics is very common when cellular automata models are used in a spatially complicated system, and it's something we can go and test in the real world. We can go to the field. Oh, in this case, I should point out that this produces log magnitude and frequency curve power laws in magnitude frequency space, which is an interesting emergent property. We can go and test this in the field. We can measure where there's erosion by walking downstream and measuring the erosion rates throughout a very long stream. The erosion rates might be higher or lower depending on where we are. And in doing so, they will, what do you know, they produce the same kind of power laws. And this is one way we can test models, is to compare the emergent forms that we get in spatially detailed observation with those made in spatially detailed theory, or in this case, simulations. Okay, I'm going to skip a bit. Here are some other examples using the same kinds of ideas. Examples such as landslides, complex landslides through space. Here's an example where we have chained a cellular automata model through time to make dynamic hill slope hydrology and river rainfall runoff models. And it's using very simple rules, in this case the Manning's equation. It doesn't even necessarily conserve the conservation of momentum, although it usually is close. And the lattices we can use are typical information like digital elevation models or land cover maps or soil maps. And they will produce dynamic flows that can be run very quickly on computers, much more quickly than normal three-dimensional simulations of hydrology. And they are testable against observation. Okay, I'm going to move ahead. A couple other examples used recently. This is a much more complicated model of sediment transport that's been used to understand the effect of the covering of sediment on rivers, its protection compared to when and how rivers will erode the bed. This is done by Rebecca Hodge. And there's a quite well-known model now called CAESAR, which was designed by Tom Coulthard at the University of Hull. And at its heart, CAESAR is a cellular automata that moves sediment of different calibers around and routes it hydraulically through space and reaches. It's one of the very few models that allows complex two-dimensional prediction of river channel change. Here's an example. One of the advantages of cellular automata is that you can couple many different kinds of models together, many different variables. This is an example, this output is an example of the Rascal model, which is Flora Larson's model from the Florida Everglades, in which she has coupled stream flow, geomorphic change, and the growth of vegetation in the Everglades. And that model is coupled in such a way that when you run it, you get clustering of both geomorphological features and vegetation, producing the ridge and slough topography that is so common in the Everglades. And it required both the spatial complexity of the variables as well as the coupling between them. Okay. The reason I've spent so much time talking about the two-dimensional nature of modeling in cellular automata is because at roughly the same time that became a growth industry, that we turned to spatially complex models in analyzing many different river forms. At the very same time, there was a dramatic growth in another aspect of river science, and that is in observation. There are different kinds of observational growth that's happened. I'm going to focus today on remote sensing. And in fact, I'm only going to focus on a few things, just some very simple ones. I'm not going to do things such as geomorphic change detection and LIDAR and radar. It's been an enormous explosion. But today I want to talk about just very simple approaches that can be used by nearly anyone. If you take a black and white air photo and look at the water of a river, and if you can sort of vaguely see the outline of the bed of the river, we call that a clear water stream. Now, many places don't have clear water streams, but if you do, you might think where it's lighter, that water must be shallower, and where it's darker, it must be deeper. That's generally true. In fact, we can contrast stretch that river, and you can get the picture on the right and realize that, in fact, mostly what you're seeing, even from a simple air photo that's been enhanced, is a spatial map of water depth. And people, even as far back as 15 years ago, began to realize if we could only get from this sort of relative depth map to absolute depth, we could start to do hydraulic, geomorphic, and ecological change mapping from even things like old air photos, and we have 60 years of air photos going back, so that would be a really useful thing to be able to do. The main problem is sort of directly relating the water depth to the brightness of the image. It's tough to fit that curve. I'm not going to go through the complexity of it, but it turns out that it's possible to do this. One way, and you don't necessarily have to be on the ground measuring at the time that the picture was taken. That's one way to do it. Another way is to realize that light gets darker, or it gets less light as an exponential function of depth. That's called the Beer-Lambert law in chemistry. And if we can combine that law with hydraulics, for example, the Manning's equation, it's possible to work out at a river section how deep the river must have been in order for the discharge to be conserved. I call that principle the hydraulically assisted bathymetry, and it's been written up in a couple of papers. I'm not going to go through the details of it, other than to say, by combining optics and hydraulics, it's possible to extract depth from images. This is called a spectral depth approach. And wouldn't it be nice if we could trust it to go back and get three-dimensional water depths from all these air photos we have sitting around? That would be a good thing. And we could get some idea of spatial complexity of rivers that way as well. Here's an example of what we might use that for. Here's an example from South Texas. This is the Nueces River. And what I've done is I've gone and downloaded a very large number of digital orthophoto quads for a big chunk of this river. And this is what the river looks like. It's a fairly shallow gravel-bedded stream. This is what the orthophotos look like when they're all grouped together. And I've had the computer go through and basically export all the rivers, all the river lengths, and we've gotten the spectral depth using the approach I mentioned a minute ago. The idea being, I want to see what the real complexity of the river is at this scale. Not the scale of miles apart from one point to another, but way down at the scale of meters or hundreds of meters at least. Now, even without getting the depth, if you just look at the width of the river in the downstream direction, the first thing you see when you do analysis like this is the tremendous diversity or complexity of these variables. This is width. And remember in your mind the hydraulic geometry that we saw near the beginning of the talk. This kind of complexity did not exist in that. And it immediately makes your mind think of, why is it there? What processes generate this kind of spatial complexity? And if you think that's complex, look at the depth of the water. Now, this is 1 or 200% variations from the mean. And it really makes you wonder about how much information are we really explaining with our current theories about river forms. Okay, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. We can do the same sorts of things with stream power. We can begin to think, well, if we can do it from air photos, maybe it's possible to do it from space, from satellite high-resolution images. And it is possible to do it at some level from space. Okay, what else could we do with information of that type? Now I'm going to introduce the idea of the Riverscape. This is a concept that's quite old, but it's been reintroduced by stream ecologists, and who have said, we perceive a need to conceptualize rivers not as sampling points, lines, or gradients, but as spatially continuous longitudinal and lateral mosaics. As such, heterogeneity in the river landscape, or riverscape, becomes the focus of study. Why should it become the focus of study? Because it's that heterogeneity that is at the scale of organisms. And for stream ecologists, it's the organisms that are at the heart of the matter. So here's an example how we might get down to that scale. Here's an example of the River Tromie in Scotland. And my colleague Patrice Carbonneau had images flown over the River Tromie. If you want to know where this is actually where the Balmoral estate where the Queen lives is. I didn't fly the helicopter over Balmoral, so lucky for me. So here's an example from the Google Earth. of what it sort of looks like. And we can take those images, put them into a computer, match them all together, and from them begin to extract metrics, extract variables, such as the water depth in the downstream direction at sort of 2-meter increments. We can extract other pieces of information. For example, we can use the complexity of these images to derive grain size measurements. If there are bigger grain sizes, the texture looks different in the images. We can use photogrammetry or perhaps LiDAR to get the stream surface elevation. And from those measurements, it becomes possible to measure and derive all sorts of variables, the widths and the depths and the cross-sectional areas, and look at their spatial complexity, and also derive variables such as the velocity of the water, the Froude or Reynolds numbers, the shear stresses, and stream powers. And this is showing the sort of very high-resolution complexity in these rivers, and this is a gravel bed river. What could we do with that information? Well, if we're interested in a particular user of the river, for example, juvenile Atlantic salmon who are going to be moving up that river, we know that they have certain preferred habitats. They like to live in certain depth water, and they need certain particle size to be habitable. And we can query our computer systems to do this, to map out where those are going to be, downstream or upstream. And then we might ask the computer, look at that map, find out what's the connectivity between those habitats. We can find out how is the river arranged in terms of good habitat or bad habitat for that particular organism. And as it turns out, in this particular river, the river is mostly quite habitable and movable for these fish. But it also turns out that the river is also carved up into 3 or 4 sections that are split from one another by very small, discrete zones, which it's very difficult for the fish to move through. In the case, these are usually high slope, high energy areas. And wouldn't it be useful if we were managing those rivers to know ahead of time where those positions were? That would be a very useful way to operate. And that's one of the main advantages of doing this kind of river analysis. Okay. Now, it's one thing if we have air photos available to us, but we're not totally in control of our own air photos, especially as students. Wouldn't it be nice if you had a tool that you could go out to a new river that you're interested in and get the data that you need? It's been difficult to do this. River science has been co-opted to some degree by big science. We have large instruments, we have terrestrial laser scanning or airborne LiDAR or radar, and it's not available to everybody easily. Well, here's a technique to allow people for small areas to go and get high three-dimensional data at a high resolution. This is called structure from motion. It comes from computer science or computer vision technology. You go out with an ordinary camera, and you take several pictures of a stream from different angles. You could do it from a balloon. We tend to put the camera on top of a tall pole and just walk around with it, and the camera takes pictures. And you come back and you put these pictures, which don't really have any information except just the picture, into a computer. And the computer thinks to itself, what would the three-dimensional nature of the environment have to be in order for these pictures to look the way they do? And it sort of works that out. And after working it out, this is what the river looked like from one of our helicopter runs, or balloon runs. After you've taken these pictures and put them in the computer, it can work out point clouds and three-dimensional surfaces. And by the way, it also gives you the colors, so it's also a remote sensing image as an output. Anybody can do this. There's now free software online. You can go and you can make your own high-quality three-dimensional data wherever you like. Data quantity is now not limited to those people with money. It's now a question of labor. Oh, by the way, I'm not going to go through this, but it works really, really, really well. It's got a very, very strong reliability associated with it. Okay. And it gives you a number of options. You can go and find your local high school kid who is interested in remote control planes. You stick a tiny little camera on there and you fly it around, and you can come back and you can have LiDAR quality, or even better than LiDAR quality, map of this braided river after an afternoon of flying. Or you can walk around with a pole up and down, and in a day you've had 200 meters mapped at the resolution of millimeters. You can see the bark on these woody debris trees as an example. Certainly you can see the particle sizes. I even put a camera floating behind one of my family's boats and just floated down for a little bit, came back, extracted the frames from the video, put them in the computer, and it made particle size maps of the bed of the river, something that would be very difficult to do from up in the air somewhere. You can even get, if you want to get really crazy with it, you could imagine wiring together 3 or 4 cameras, which is now relatively easily to do, and fire them all at the same time. And if they're fired at the same time, that means you can make 3-dimensional maps of things that are moving, like the water surface. Here's an example of a water surface in a coastal stream here in Oregon. And the pictures are taken at the same time, and you can see water waves here. And by taking the pictures at the same time, it's possible to produce 3-dimensional maps of the water surface elevations, here at the scale of, again, of millimeters or at least centimeters. And if we can make depth maps and water surface maps easily, it means that we can use our models to solve for something else other than just the water surface. For example, the effective resistance of the river. And what an interesting way to put together models and remote sensing, is to solve for things that we've normally had to estimate or approximate. And that sort of idea is going to have to be scaled up if we're going to be able to do global scale monitoring. For example, radar monitoring of the world's rivers. This is NASA's SWAT satellite, which is currently in development. We need to be able to take measurements from this kind of satellite and convert them into important river variables like discharge, like quantities or volumes of water. And it's going to require sort of careful hybrids of the monitoring information and the modeling information. Okay. To finish up here, just a couple thoughts about how we think about theory and observation after we've gone through this methodological revolution where we used to be a data-poor science and now we are a data-rich science. One of them is that the complexity of the rivers is kind of the order of business. And our theories need to be tested at the scale of the variability that we see. For example, I'm going to move ahead here. If we're looking at the diversity of habitats, where do we see the diversity of habitats? We see it at the scale of those habitats. They could be pools or riffles that are used by fish or macroinvertebrates, and those are at the scales of meters or tens of meters. It's important that if we're going to test theories about habitats, we have to have observational techniques that will see things at the scale of those habitats. And we don't test them at scales of, say, kilometers. This one here shows riverbank failures and the uncertainties with that. And what's mapped on the right here is the probability of failure or the rate of failure. And the changes in the rate of failure is at scales that are of tens to hundreds of meters. So we would need to have measurement or observational tools for that scale. There are sometimes ways that we can use advanced techniques to test these theory at many scales. There's an example called Wavelet Analysis. This is a triangle which I've recently published, a kind of analysis called Hyperscale Analysis, and it allows you to look at river information and to say, what's the relationship between one variable and another at many different scales? If we want to relate width and depth, for example, what scale we do it? And I'm not going to go through these triangles. We don't really have time. But I'd like to point out that depending where you are in a river, width and depth do not necessarily co-vary with one another at any given scale. If you look at broad scales, width and depth relate to one another often. At smaller scales, you can have widths that are associated with small depths or large depths. And it would be useful to know that if we're going to have models that relate width and depth. Okay, I'd like to finish with a philosophical thought or two about representation. All throughout the lecture today, I've tried to show how we have representations are bound up with prediction and understanding of rivers. And students today, I almost feel sorry for them because they have such an enormous diversity of representations that they're confronted with when they study rivers. You know, and this idea has been around a long time. Here's a Monet, and it has one representation of the river. Here's an example. Rivers are nothing but pipes and valves. This is the Columbia River Basin. Sort of like the London subway, something like that. We can have rivers as a raster image, and its data as a raster image. We can have rivers as polygons, and that's how it often is when we do classifications of streams. We can have rivers as areas that are connected by pipes, like here is a Heck HMS model. We can have rivers that are cellular automata. Here's a list flood model of flood flow. Here's an example of voxels, where the rivers are actually a set of three-dimensional cubes, here used for stratigraphy and sedimentology. We can have rivers as one-dimensional lines, here in meandering studies. We can have rivers as simple cellular automata. We can have rivers as landscape evolution using interconnected lines. We can have rivers as 2.5-dimensional DEMs. We can have rivers as particles that are moved through a field, an individual base model or a particle model. We can have rivers that are 2.5-dimensional dynamic hydrology models. We can have rivers that are a combination of many of these different representational aspects. Why do we choose the different representations? Sometimes we choose them because it's what our advisor taught us, or it's because that's what was in the article I read last week. But it's becoming clear that the most important thing in student training is to pick representations that match the research question, that match what you need. In this case, the slide shows two totally different representations for the same river. In one case, sediment transport, and the other is fish migration. This is by Martin Doyle's work. The sediment transport might be from cells, and the fish migrate as individual spots or organisms. And you know, we can make computer models that operate in terms of individuals or particles rather than cells. This is called an agent-based model, and it's useful both in physical processes like in this case pollution, or it could be mobile individuals like fish moving up our two-dimensional cellular riverscape. I think what's important here is to be flexible and to be able to use hybrid principles when they're necessary, to put them together in order to answer the research question you're interested in. And in doing so, you know, they can make their own maps in some cases if you have mobile organisms. I think it's important to think this way because for such a long time we've had no option other than to simplify the riverscape to do analysis. We've had no option. We just didn't have the data. We didn't have the modeling techniques. We didn't have the computer power. And yet when you go out in the field and you ask a person who's a fly fisherman, or if you watch the animals interacting with the river, it's an incredibly complicated, variable place. And now that we are beginning to have the tools to actually look at this complexity, I think it gets back to Leonardo's thought of how do we represent rivers, at what scale shall we represent rivers, and how does those representations, who should they apply to? Whose view of the river should we have for any particular river science question? Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Mark. That was like quite a whirlwind tour of all sorts of topics. There's a couple of questions or comments, actually, on the box there. And Daniel asked about what kind of free SFM software would you recommend? Rocco's mentions Visual SFM, but also states that paying for AGI Soft is worth it.
Yes, I see that. The basic question is, what kind of structure for motion software would I recommend? We use structure for motion so much now in my group and in my department that we decided to pay the money for Agisoft Photo Scan, which is one of the things mentioned here. It's about $500 license for an educational purpose. It has the advantage of, in addition to being able to make point clouds, it'll also do DEM, orthophoto construction, and a number of other things like visualizations. But it is money. I would recommend it if you want the sort of Cadillac version, the most obvious advantages. But actually, if you have some GIS software available to you, getting point clouds from free software like Visual SFM is perfectly reasonable for many or even most projects.
Feel free to ask questions through the chat box, or if you want to unmute your phone and ask something over the phone. Michael Alchin asks, have you incorporated GE OBIA principles into your RS analyses, and if so, have you found it useful?
The answer to that is not specifically no. I'm not quite up to date. I've been mostly doing geomorphic work, but I'd be interested to hear more about that. And I'm just starting to get into ecological monitoring as part of the remote sensing processes, so that's something perhaps for the future.
Indrini from SUNY ESF asks, I'm intrigued by your water surface elevation maps and freedom they provide to solve for flow resistance. How did you seed the water surface to reflect light to the cameras?
That's an excellent question. How do you might think normally when we look at remote sensing images of water, the light just goes straight through the surface. There's a couple ways that you can do it. I tend to work in mountain rivers where the surface of the water has quite a bit of complexity. The water splits into a lot of little facets, and the reflectance difference of those facets mean that it's actually pretty easy to do structure from motion off of them. Sometimes you're not so lucky, and there are ways to do that. One of them is to seed the surface with some kind of material. We actually tried one time putting in little bits of pine needles and things like that. I haven't played a lot with that because I haven't needed to. The water bubbles tend to do it. I've also thought that it might be possible to do it just by putting a near-infrared filter over the camera, because it would remove the light that goes into the water surface. So I don't actually know in every case what would work best, but I think that people would be surprised at how much does reflect when you're looking at the water surface from an angle rather than from above.
Doug Alsdorf asks, do you know of river models that combine the flow of water with water-related diseases such as cholera?
I don't specifically. I don't know if I haven't looked into that literature. That would be great to know. I have had a student make an agent-based model of dengue fever in partially flooded areas. But that would be a wonderful example, application if people had done that. I'd love to hear about that.
Well, I had a question on lattice-based elements. Is there a size that you would recommend? I mean, what kind of scale would you start at, I guess, is the question.
It's a little bit of a, I'll answer that question by inverting it, which is to return to the thing I mentioned earlier, which is, what's your research question? That's how we tend to force ourselves to think. If what you need to see are particles at the bottom of the river, you need to have resolution that will see those particles, and then you're pretty much limited by either your observational platform or the size of your computer to do modeling. And so it actually makes it difficult to answer the question, how big of a computer or what do you need to do my work? You have to first think, what does my work require? It's kind of turn it backwards, I guess. There are definitely computational limits. Agent-based models, for example, like the fish models I showed at the end, are quite computationally heavy currently. It may be possible in the future to parallelize computers to work them more easily, but we are limited right now to sort of hundreds of individuals or hundreds of agents. It is a difficult thing. From a remote sensing standpoint, in cellular automata, though, many people have made models of whole rivers. So it's not out of the realm of possibility for most projects.
Well, Lee asked the questions, can an autocellular model be derived from basic principles in fluid mechanics or hydraulics? How does a model compare with a physically or mechanics-based model?
Yes. In other words, how physically real are these models? That's an excellent question. There's a lot of discussion right now about exactly that question. And the answer is different models can be built to different levels of physical realism. I mentioned lattice gas or lattice Boltzmann models. They're a type of cellular automata model, and they are actually just as realistic as more traditional ways to solve Navier-Stokes equation. They're just as real. It's an extremely high level of realism. The sort of more commonly used cellular automata for river flow, for example, the one I showed earlier for rainfall runoff, is kind of, I would say it's about 80% in terms of its realism, or 80 and 90%. There are some approximations it makes in terms of momentum. There has been some study about their actual reality. Andrew Nicholas at Exeter has studied that, and it's actually been very enlightening, and he's found that actually they're quite reliable in many cases, but it's an area that needs more study, to be honest.
Well, Daniel asked another question. Do you know of an affordable, lightweight thermal camera that could be carried on a small quadricopter?
Do you know of a, yeah, I work with quadricopters occasionally, and I have mixed results with them. They're more difficult than I thought they would be when I first got into it, and their main problem is weight limits. Unfortunately, FLIR, which is the company that most commonly makes the thermal cameras, is just too heavy right now for most of the quadricopters I've ever seen used by groups. It may be that that's changing, but we haven't quite gotten there yet. I would love to be able to put a FLIR camera on one of my remote control aircraft and fly it over a river. That would be wonderful, but we're not quite there yet.
I had another question on your automata. If it would change, if the rules would change, say it's Froude number, sub or supercritical, would you have different rules that would be invoked?
I think so. I think the rules that are there right now are for a fairly limited hydraulic set of conditions. If you were going to have extreme differences in the Froude number, for example, or definitely the Reynolds number, I would think you would need to build more realism into your rules.
And so your rules are sort of static, is that true, or are they state-based rules?
In this case, all the rules are all the same for all the cells. That's one of the common things that you do in a cellular automata. It doesn't have to be that way. I think actually one of the main limits that we have right now for river flow is that they're one layer. They're depth averaged. And I think an enterprising young mind could figure out a way to put more than one layer of water and actually induce things like secondary currents with the right rules. That would be really useful.
Well, thank you, Mark. We're reaching the top of the hour, and thank you, everybody, for joining us this afternoon. Again, we have another one coming up next week. I hope you can join us for that one as well. And if you have additional questions, please don't hesitate to contact Mark at the University of Oregon. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you to everybody.